Tom Barlow walked into town with his hat pulled low over his eyes, the brim smudged with sweat and dust, leather gloves clutched loosely in one hand. He didn't ride hard, didn't announce himself. His horse followed obediently, a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face. There was a quiet that clung to him, the sort of silence that made strangers give him space. As if he carried a weight the wind itself respected, Tom had been on the trail for months, following rumors of cattle rustlers and land swindlers, but it wasn't the law that drove him anymore, not really. It was a past he'd tried to outrun, but memory has a way of settling into the bones. No matter how far you ride, the first time he saw her, she was on the auction block at the edge of town, her dress worn and threadbare, hands bound in rough rope. Her hair was a tangle of sun-bleached brown, her eyes wide and terrified. The men in the crowd laughed and whispered, voices sharp with greed. $20? One called. She fetch more for a few months of work. 30, I'll give 30, another shouted. Tom's jaw tightened, though he kept his hands where the rope marks on his knuckles wouldn't show. He had no right to intervene, not yet, but the look in her eyes struck him like a rifle shot. Fear so pure, so raw, that it left no room for anything else. She flinched when a man stepped closer, rubbing his palms together, his boots scraping the wooden planks. Easy there, Tom muttered under his breath, but not loud enough for anyone else to hear. He felt the stirrings of a decision that would alter the quiet, disciplined life he'd carved from the wilderness. The auctioneer's gavel pounded. The bidding soared. And then, in a motion as sudden as the wind lifting sand off the prairie, Tom stepped forward. "I'll take her," he said. The town went silent. A few people laughed, others whispered, all eyes settling on him. "You?" That man there?" the auctioneer barked, squinting. "Why in God's name would you buy her?" Tom didn't answer. He tossed down the money, leather jingling against coin, and offered his hand to the woman. She looked at him like he'd just pulled a ghost from the horizon. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the society's standards. Scarred hands, wary eyes, a spine that had been broken and mended in ways invisible. She hesitated, and then, slowly, she took his hand. By the time they left Sagebrush, the wind had turned colder. The sun dipped toward the hills, staining the dust red. Tom rode beside her, saying nothing. She had not spoken since the auction ended. Not a word, though her eyes watched him, trying to read the quiet storm behind them. Her name, she said later, was Lila. She was 19, and she'd been raised on the wrong side of every law, every moral boundary, by men who considered her nothing more than property. Tom didn't ask questions, not yet. He knew better than to pry. Sometimes silence is louder than 1,000 words. The town fumed for weeks. Rumors ran wild. Tom Barlow, the poor fool, they said, married that ugly girl and just gave up his chance to live a proper life. Tom didn't care. He didn't have a proper life. What he had was a sense of what was right. And right now, that meant getting Lila away from Sagebrush before the law the townsfolk decided to correct their mistake. Their first night on the trail, Tom made a fire near a dry creek bed, the smell of sage and smoke filling the air. Lila sat beside him, the rope marks still faintly visible on her wrists. She stared into the flames, as if trying to memorize the way the light licked the shadows. "You don't have to talk," Tom said finally. His voice was low, edged with the kind of tiredness that comes from carrying more than a body can bear. She shook her head. I don't know how." "Then don't. Just listen." And so they rode in silence for days. Tom watched the horizon, listening to the creak of leather and the rhythm of hooves against dry soil. He knew the world was wide and cruel. But he also knew that even in a world like that, some acts were worth the trouble they brought. By the third week, the townsfolk had sent men after them. Corrupt lawmen and opportunistic ranchers, greedy eyes gleaming in the sun, tracking them through canyons and arroyos. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the desert, Tom sensed them before he saw them. The wind shifted. A faint echo of metal on metal, the subtle rhythm of footsteps not his own. "Stay close," he whispered to Lila. They rode into a narrow ravine. dust swirling around their horses' hooves, and Tom's hand hovered over his revolver. He didn't like violence, never had, but he understood it. He understood what it meant to protect what mattered. The first man emerged from behind a boulder, gun raised. Tom didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, a crack that split the canyon, and the man dropped, a cloud of dust rising around him. Another took cover, shouting, and then there were three, and Tom fired again. Lila's eyes were wide, but she didn't flinch, not once. When it was over, the silence returned, heavier than before. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Tom looked at Lila. She touched his arm, a trembling hand, and he nodded. He knew the violence had marked them, carved them in a new way, but it had also bound them closer. They made camp under the stars. Lila finally spoke, voice quiet as the wind through the mesquite. "Why?" Tom didn't answer right away. He stared at the fire. "Because no one else would," she let the words hang. Not a question, not a judgment, just a statement. And in that moment, Tom realized something he hadn't known he'd been seeking. The weight of a life that meant something to someone else. Weeks passed. They crossed rivers and plains, sleeping under the open sky, eating what the land offered. Slowly, Lila began to trust. She learned to ride properly, to handle a gun, to read the signs of weather and predator. And in return, she gave Tom her laughter, soft, hesitant, like a candle flickering in a draft, but enough to keep the dark from swallowing him entirely. One morning, as they approached a distant ridge, they saw smoke rising from a homestead. Tom tightened his reins. "Stay back," he said. They approached cautiously. The house was empty, doors hanging open, cattle wandering loose, but the land had promise, fertile and overlooked. Tom set to work, staking a claim, repairing fences, building shelter. He worked in silence, sweat running down his back, dust coating his skin. Lila helped where she could, and in the evenings they sat together. The quiet between them no longer oppressive, but comforting. Then the town found them. A group rode in, led by the same corrupt sheriff who had stared down the auction block weeks before. They demanded the girl. They demanded justice, as they called it, but Tom called it theft. "You have no claim." The sheriff sneered, spurs jangling. "I have her claim," Tom said simply, "and she's not property." Lila stepped forward, for the first time standing. Beside him, fully unafraid, her voice was firm. "I choose where I go, I choose my life," the sheriff spat. Guns were drawn, and in the silence that followed, the wind seemed to lean in closer, carrying the heat and the dust and the weight of every choice Tom had ever made. The fight was brutal, but measured. Tom moved with quiet precision, protecting Lila without letting anger take him over. The men were driven off, limping and swearing, and the homestead remained theirs. That night, Tom and Lila sat on the porch, looking out over the land that had nearly killed them and yet given them life. "You did it," she said softly. "I did what had to be done," he replied, voice rough from dust and exertion. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I didn't think anyone would, ever," Tom didn't answer. He let the wind and the stars answer for him. The silence a testament to choices made in the face of fear, cruelty, and indifference. By the end, it wasn't about being ugly or poor or about townsfolk's laughter or sneers. It was about a man and a woman, both carrying scars, finding a place where the world's wrongs couldn't touch them. And though the past would never leave him, Tom Barlow finally understood something he'd always avoided. That courage wasn't loud and redemption wasn't flashy. Sometimes it was simply saying yes to someone else's life, even when it cost you everything. The homestead stood against the horizon, dust and sunlight mingling. Lila worked in the garden, her hands steady. Tom tended to the fences, his gaze drifting to the endless plains. Neither spoke of the town, of the auction block, of the men who had tried to take what was not theirs. The land and the wind held those memories, but here, in this quiet corner of the world, life had a chance to breathe again, and as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky with blood orange and violet, Tom let the silence between them carry the weight of all they had survived. They were alone in the vast, unforgiving West, yet not lonely. And for the first time, both knew what it meant to be free.